Texas trailblazer Louise Raggio was supported in part by the Denton Appleton Baldwin Fund and by members like you. Thank you.
I had no idea that I would become a lawyer or that I would have any part in changing the laws in Texas. My husband Greer was such a handsome, dashing, personable creature. I've often said that the guy that went overseas never came back. I knew that I had to at least be able to support the family. I'm not just going to keep batting my head against the wall. All the states had problems so far as women were concerned, but Texas had the worst. What we did was to give women and men equal rights. We were the first generation who showed that married women could be professionals and have husbands and children and still do a real professional job.
Louise Ballerstedt was born on June 15, 1919. She grew up on a small 100-acre farm in central Texas.
We lived in the mud, and when it rained, you couldn't get to school. So that was during the depths of the Depression, when we really didn't have any money, and we'd have failures, and some years we wouldn't make $500 in cash.
In those days, farm kids were often used for labor, but Hilma Ballerstedt was intent on her daughter having a university education.
Mother had lost 2 children before I was born, and so I grew up as an only child. And in many ways, I was doing the things that Mother would have liked to have done. When I was born, women did not have the right to vote. But my mother, although she was self-educated, she really had very little formal education. She could see no reason for women not voting. And in fact, when Mother and Dad finally bought a Model T Ford, women were not supposed to drive. And Mother thought that was ridiculous. And so she started driving, and she drove until she was in her 90s.
Louise's mother was her first and most significant mentor. Her father, Louis, the provider. He went along with Hilma's ambitions for their daughter, even working a construction job during the Depression so Louise could attend high school in Austin. She graduated valedictorian in 1936 and entered the University of Texas.
It was my mother that was taking the flack from the community about how ridiculous it was for a poor farm girl to be in a fancy thing like college. And the University of Texas was very expensive at that time. The tuition was $25 a semester. You could take 18, 20 hours for $25. And of course, I had jobs from the time I entered. I loved journalism. I really wanted to be a journalist. But during the Depression, of course, the idea was to be able to get a paycheck, to earn a living. At that time, a woman could be either a secretary, a nurse, or a school teacher, or maybe a librarian. So I took 26 hours of education instead of the courses that I really would have enjoyed.
Louise graduated second in her class in 1939 with her teaching certification.
This was so important to my dad that that certificate was in the safe deposit box at the bank along with the deeds. It was that important to him that his daughter had a way to get a job and make a living. At that time, one of the almost horrors that a female had was to be an old maid. And I can remember when I was working, and Jake Pickle, who was later a congressman, he called me the old maid because here I was 21 and not married.
After graduating from the University of Texas, Louise spent a year working in Washington, D.C. as a Rockefeller Fellow. She reluctantly returned to Texas for a job with the National Youth Administration. Back in Austin, she met attorney Greer Raggio.
I knew I wanted to get married. I didn't want to be an old maid. My husband Greer was such a handsome, dashing, personable creature. Frankly, when he proposed, I accepted, and we got married in April of '41.
Greer proposed on the first date, and Louise said yes. 3 months and 5 days later, they eloped. The honeymoon didn't last long.
The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
We married, and my husband was drafted into the service for World War II. We had a child before he went overseas. He spent 2.5 years in the South Pacific. He was in all of that fighting, going from island to island to island, ending up 5 months on the ground at Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was some of the bloodiest, traumatic service.
Louise and Greer exchanged more than 1,500 letters, but the words did little to bridge the 3-year gap. When Greer returned, they were like strangers.
The guy that went overseas never came back. He had flashbacks and nightmares the rest of his life.
To make matters worse, Greer was one of Senator Joseph McCarthy's early targets, accused of being a communist sympathizer.
One communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
It was very serious at that time. He was fired from his federal job. We were one of the few people that were reinstated because it was pure garbage. I knew that if those charges stuck, that there would be no way that my husband could keep a federal job and really be promoted. That would always be a mark against him. So I knew that I had to at least be able to support the family.
With Greer's encouragement, Louise entered the law school at Southern Methodist University in 1948. She was the only woman in her class.
They really didn't want me. They said I would take the place of a man who would do something with the degree. And they were correct, because at that time, no firm would hire a woman lawyer. But they couldn't keep me out.
During the day, Louise juggled 2 boys and a newborn while Greer worked. In the evenings, he took over so she could go to night school. Their oldest son, Greer Jr.
Well, it was pretty stressful, short of money, short of time.
Younger brother, Tom.
I can remember her going off to law school and trying to make her feel guilty that she wasn't going to be right there by holding onto her legs and say, "Don't leave."
She was very, very tired. There was a level of stress for everybody.
just graduated with her law degree in June of 1952. It took her 2 years to find a job.
Remember, in those days, there were very few women who were employed. Most women were housewives and mothers.
I remember when there was this kind of fake family meeting to whether Mom was to take this job in the district attorney's office. And of course, the decision had already been made, and I said, I don't think that's a good idea. You know, not having her around on a regular basis, it was difficult in some ways. Tom, I know, used to get in fights in grade school because people would make fun of him because his mother wasn't at home.
Louise went to work for the Dallas County District Attorney's Office in February of 1954. DA Henry Wade hired her to try family law cases. Her salary, $350 a month. The men in the office were being paid twice as much.
I was so glad to get a job, I didn't say anything about it.
Judge Sarah T. Hughes was responsible for getting Louise's career off the ground. Hughes was the first woman appointed to the federal bench in Texas.
It is a great honor and likewise a challenge for me to do my very best efforts to live up to the federal judiciary.
In the 40s and 50s, women who had succeeded were not helping other women. In other words, I've climbed the ladder, bring the ladder up after me. Sarah Hughes was the only woman that helped me. And she was not helping me as an individual as much as she wanted women to get to certain levels.
After about a year and a half of working on divorce and child support cases, in 1955, Louise was promoted to be the first female criminal prosecutor. Only a year earlier had Texas women received the right to serve on juries.
I tried the first case in Texas with an all-female jury. The papers were saying that the streets weren't going to be safe because women were so soft-headed they'd let all the criminals loose. So the jury panel came up. It was 10 women and 2 men. This was a 6-person jury. So obviously I struck the 2 men, and we tried this aggravated assault case. And the women convicted the man. I don't know whether the man got a fair trial, but the women were going to show that they could convict a man. And of course, that was in newspapers all over the state. Women jury convicts man.
After 2 years working for the state, Greer convinced his wife to join his new private firm. For Louise, it was a new beginning.
A new movement for women's liberation is launched, and once again protesters take to the street to support their demands for total freedom.
During the 60s, I was really trying to get leadership in the State Bar of Texas. Texas had the worst laws in the whole United States, discriminatory especially toward married women.
The 1960s was a decade of change for the Raggios. The law firm was growing, the boys were turning into men, and Louise was stepping into politics.
Basically, when a man and woman married, they said the husband and wife are one, and he was the one, because all of her property rights when she married were not hers anymore.
The women's movement was taking shape nationally, but there was little activity in the South. In Texas, married women basically had the same rights as children. A woman could run her own legal affairs only if she was single, widowed, or divorced.
If she owned an apartment house, free and clear, when she married, the rents belonged to her husband. If she couldn't sell property without his joinder and consent. And if she had a bank account, he could tell the bank not to let her withdraw any of her funds.
Louise was aggravated by the legal restrictions imposed on married women. She had experienced them both personally and professionally.
Many of us believed that we married women lawyers, we married women doctors, we married women accountants, were practicing illegally because theoretically we should have had our husbands sign every pleading that we prepared. When I had to make bonds, I would have to take the papers and have my husband sign the bond because as a married woman, my signature was not valid.
Louise had always been an advocate for equal rights. But when Texas lawmakers consistently ignored the pleas of the business and professional women's group fighting for a constitutional amendment, Louise tried a different approach.
I'm not just going to keep batting my head against a wall, and especially a big brick wall like this was in the Texas legislature.
These business people who couldn't even really discuss the issues with the radical feminist movement of that time. My mother bridged the gap, and she was able to get it done.
Louise quit working with the business and professional women's group and aligned with the conservative State Bar of Texas. By 1964, she had worked her way up to chair the family law section. Her plan was to create a new statute tantamount to the Equal Rights Amendment. But first, she had to get the Marital Property Act assigned to her section. Enter State Bar Chair Clint Small.
Clint Small was president of the State Bar, a wonderful guy, and my friend. So at a party, when a lot of people had had too much to drink and it was a lot of noise, I went up to Clint Small and said, "Clint, would you please assign the Marital Property Act to the family law section instead of a committee?" And Clint said, "Honey, you can have anything you want."
That was one of her tricks, was to play dumb, and she wasn't. She would come up and talk to these big-time lawyers and politicians and just say, "Well, you know, maybe we could do this, and could you help?" And she knew very well how to do it.
As soon as I got back to my office, I wrote Clint a letter thanking him profusely for having so much confidence in the family law section to assign this big job to us.
Louise immediately created a task force of the very best legal minds in Texas. 2 years later, she presented the Marital Property Act, revolutionizing family law to Texas lawmakers.
Our sponsor in the House was a wonderful guy from Austin named Gene Fondren. And I said, "Gene, how are you going to get this bill passed by the House when you know the members are basically against it?" And Gene said, "I'll just get up and mumble and mumble." And that's what he did.
It worked, but with a wink and a nudge from then Speaker of the House, Ben Barnes. Louise and Barnes had a deal. She would speak out against the Equal Rights Amendment, calling it premature, and Barnes would make sure her legislation passed. The business and professional women's group, who had been fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment for a decade, was left out in the cold. They were so angry, they testified against Louise's bill.
The legislators were so mad by that time at the BNPW that they passed the Marital Property Act without really knowing what was in it, because the Marital Property Act of 1967 actually gave the same results as a constitutional amendment. This was massive legislation that changed Texas law 180 degrees.
The bill passed through the House unanimously, and there were only 2 votes cast against it in the Senate. As soon as Governor John Connally signed the Marital Property Act in 1967, Louise began traveling the state to explain the new law.
We were not popular at the 16 different seminars we had. In fact, I was called a number of names that weren't very flattering, like "you meddling female, we've been practicing like this for 100 years. Why did you go have to mess up everything?" The wonderful part is that this Marital Property Act works so well. None of it has ever been held unconstitutional.
In fact, the marital property law helped lay the groundwork for the Equal Rights Amendment, which breezed through the Texas legislature in 1971.
So now Texas has the Equal Rights Amendment, plus all the statutes that put flesh on big bones of the constitutional amendment. So we had a win-win situation for equal rights in Texas for women.
Louise's journey for equal rights in the 60s didn't come without sacrifice.
We would just, have it up to our ears, just think we can't take another thing.
She took great comfort in her friend Vivian Castleberry, who was also balancing a career and family.
We would have lunch together and sort of cry on each other's shoulders about the discriminations and about the challenges we had because we were female.
For Louise, life at home wasn't always easy. Ken Raggio is Louise's youngest son.
Well, it was tough being Mr. Louise Raggio for Dad. He was volatile-tempered.
She had these pressures, and I think that sometimes that she just would descend into a depression, and it was difficult to get her out sometimes. I mean, I remember walking her around the block, walk and just to get out and to say, what's bugging you? She wouldn't know.
And the adversariness of law, bothered her. But this was the hand she was dealt, and you take what's in front of you and do the best you can with them, and just keep going.
We were the first generation of women who showed that married women could be professionals and have husbands and children and still do a real professional job.
The Marital Property Act was just the first in a new code of family laws in Texas that would act as a model for every state in the country. In the 70s and 80s, Louise was the driving force behind each and every major reform.
She's been Super Louise, starting when she was a kid, culminated in the 60s and 70s and 80s and stuff, being a real heavyweight for moving the ball forward.
To me, she was just Mom. Not until I had discussions with other people in the business community, other lawyers, did I understand what a significant impact that she had upon the laws, in particular women's rights, what energy that she had. I mean, it was amazing. I still, to this day, will have somebody say, your mother represented me 25 years ago and gave me this bit of advice which was so extremely on point and valid then as well as now, and I listened to her, and I'm a much better person for it.
In 1979, Louise became the first woman director of the State Bar of Texas. It was a tough position for her to accept because just a year earlier, Greer had suffered a massive heart attack. He recovered against the odds to spend 10 more years with Louise, the best of their marriage. He died just a few days before their 47th wedding anniversary. Louise never remarried.
Oh, we haven't gotten to where we need to be, but we're certainly further along than we were when we started out.
Louise's strength to excel in difficult, often heartbreaking conditions is a testament to her character. For the last 20 years, she has continued to find ways to create a more equitable and fair society by promoting the interests of women.
Well, we need for women to have more acceptance in the highest positions, you know. There's still this ceiling that women can't get through. We need to understand that women are as capable as men.
For Louise, proving herself as a career woman meant proving herself as a working mother. Her professional accomplishments would have had less meaning, she says, if she couldn't point to her family with pride.
Can you laugh? My sons are capable of running this place because they're all intelligent, beautiful young men, and I'm very proud of them. I always put my family first. I always was there for the activities. They were always my first. It came out of having less time for myself, because I was always doing things for other people.
Life didn't unfold the way Louise had dreamed, but her ceaseless passion and ingenuity makes her an icon and a trailblazer whose sacrifices have given generations of women the freedom to follow their own hearts.
I think I had to be like I was and have the respect of the guys, but to know that I was a serious professional. So I think it's very important for every woman to do her very best all the time.
Texas trailblazer Louise Raggio was supported in part by the Denton Appleton Baldwin Fund and by members like you. Thank you.